and welcome everyone to the rise of organic wine in New Zealand. I'm absolutely thrilled to be on this panel today, talking to a fantastic bunch of people who are incredibly knowledgeable and passionate about this subject. It's one that's dear to my heart, and I think you'll get a lot of interesting information about what's going on in organic wine in New Zealand, because there is a lot. So with me today, we've got Anna Flaude, who's winemaker and GM of Te Whare Wines in Marlborough, which she owns along with her husband, Jason Flaude. I'm joined by Hugh Kinch, who's winemaker and estate manager at Pyramid Valley Wines, which are based in North Canterbury. And we're also joined by Jared White, who organises the wine and viticulture for BioGrow, which is New Zealand's largest organic certifier. They're responsible for 98% of the organic wines in New Zealand. Jared's also been involved in the exec of Organic Wines New Zealand since its inception. So a super knowledgeable team here, and excited to have a chat. So many of you will be familiar with New Zealand Wines has got a very strong sustainable wine growing program, which has been going for 25 years now. And there's around about 97% of producers' vineyard land certified under that. So we're no stranger to looking after the land and making sure that sustainability is a strong platform for our wines. But obviously organics is one step further along, or quite a few steps further along in many cases from that. And that is something that's really on the rise here in New Zealand. So between the 2017 to 2020 period, there's been a 33% increase in certified vineyards in New Zealand, and a roughly parallel increase in the sales here domestically. Our organic wine exports have risen by 65 million, which is a pretty impressive sort of stat. So there's now over 2,200 hectares of organic vineyards certified here in New Zealand, and there are also quite a large number of people who are moving towards organics, either in conversion or who are practicing organics as well. So Jared, I think you'd be a great person to kick off to give us some context here on what it actually means for wineries and vineyards to go through that process of certification within a New Zealand context.
Yeah, sure. So it takes 3 years for a vineyard to become certified organic from the official start date of their organic management. So that's called the conversion period from their registration date until they're fully certified. And so, as you mentioned, there's actually just over 2,400 hectares of vineyard area that's managed organically in New Zealand. And of that, 18% of it is currently in conversion. So it's undergoing that first 3-year period. So that is consistent around the world. The rules for conversion are 3 years from the start of organic management, the official start of organic management, until fully certified. And that's different from the winemaking. So that works vintage to vintage, if you like. If you can get organic grapes or you own organic grapes, you can make organic wine, and there's no conversion period for that. So there are just over 100 companies in New Zealand that have a certified organic brand, and many of those export.
Fantastic. So I should actually just quickly add in here too, because in my excitement and haste to start talking about organic wine, there is a little bit of housekeeping I should just mention for all of you viewers out there, because we do have a live chat function, which people will be able to use to ask questions as we go along. And with each session, there is we've got a fantastic person to run you through and answer those questions. So if you're attending session 1, it's Nigel Greening of Felton Road, who is quite a character and incredibly knowledgeable and very experienced in this area. And equally, in session 2, you're lucky enough to have Clive Dougal, who is of Deep Down Wines, and he's the current chair of Organic Wine Growers. And again, fantastic experience and knowledge. So please take advantage of that function. Ask as many questions as you want to as we go along. There will also be some information on the bottom of your screen that you will be able to access that has some stats and facts and figures and things. So big thank you to Organic Wine Growers for organising all of that. And sorry, Jared, I'll jump back in because this is a great discussion. So in terms of wineries, there's well over 200 wineries, I believe, who have organic certification, and they may not all of their wines organic, but some. That's also...
Yeah, that's right. I would say easiest way to think about it is there's 102 brands in New Zealand, or brand owners, that have certification for their wine brand. And then there are also some other companies that are certified to make organic wine but don't have their own brand. So they're contract winemakers that make wine for other brands. Yep.
Yeah. And so for people in the North American and the UK markets, how would they be able to necessarily identify those wines and see those wines on their shelves? They'll be looking for the BioGrow label?
In most cases, they have the BioGrow logo on the label, usually on the back label. Yeah. And they're often branded as organic wine, particularly in the UK or EU. And in Canada, they are labelled as organic wine in English and French. And in the US, there's two different tiers of organic wine, if you like. There's organic wine, and that's made without the use of sulphur. And that's a less common tier of wine in New Zealand. There's not very many people that make that kind of organic wine. The more common organic wine that's exported to the US is labelled made with organic grapes. And the reason for that is there's an allowance of up to 100 parts per million total sulphur in the final wine. Right. And that's regarded as important to protect the wine. So most winemakers use sulphur in their winemaking.
Yeah. And so that's my understanding, is that some of those subtle differences in the markets are around the use of both sulfites, yeasts, and in some instances copper. Is that correct, as to how there can be divisions there? The differences between, so I would say, going back to the vineyards, differences between the regulations in different countries. A lot of countries have a regulation which controls organic claims. So if you're going to make an organic claim in Canada or the US or EU, you must meet the government regulation. And there are not many differences between the regulations for wine growing, grape growing. And for that reason, most growers in New Zealand are certified to all of those markets. But there are significant differences when it comes to the wine production. And in particular, the US and Canada have tighter limits on the use of sulphur, and they allow no copper to be used in the wine. And Canada, there's only a limited range of yeasts that we're able to approve for wines that are made for the Canadian market. Right. So that's the main differences. Yeah. So Jared, you mentioned that there are the two tiers of organic wine in the US. That's something I wasn't super familiar with how that worked. Can you explain that in a little more detail, please?
Yeah, sure. There is a lot of confusion in the USA in particular. The regulation allows for wine to be labelled as made with organic grapes if sulphur dioxide has been used in the winemaking. And that, for pretty much all of the premium organic wine that's sold in the US, at least all of the premium wine exported from New Zealand to the US, is labelled made with organic grapes. To make that organic wine claim, the wine must be made without any sulphur dioxide. And most winemakers are really reluctant to do that because the sulphur protects the wine. So although there is organic wine labelled as organic wine in the US, it tends to be the lower end wines that is available. And because of that, there's some confusion and misunderstanding about the quality of organic wine. If people see organic wine labelled as organic wine and they try that, they might find that that's slightly lower quality. If they look for wine made with organic grapes, that's the higher quality in general.
Right. Yeah. And so for the most part, obviously, consumers don't need to worry too much about those details. They just need to make sure they're looking for the organic wine.
That's right.
Yeah. So, Anna, I saw you nodding along there as well. So obviously based in Marlborough there, and I've got a rather lovely glass of Te Wharewa Toru, which is a field blend of 3 grapes there. So thank you. We've got a couple of other Marlborough wines to enjoy as well, which is makes it quite delicious because there's quite, I suppose, in terms of Marlborough is obviously biggest region by a long way. And I know that maybe not necessarily many people are associating that with organic wine, but when I think of, some producers that I really happen to love, a lot of them are the organic producers based there in Marlborough. So you've got quite a tight-knit team and you've been going there for 17 years. Can you kind of walk us through a bit your experience there with Organic Vineyard?
Our kind of pathway with organics, I guess, was partly because we bought an old vineyard and it was really about bringing that back to life again. We jumped in, I guess, boots and all, and it was great to have a few other supporters in the region. But yeah, it's been an interesting journey, and it's great to see so many more people now, coming that way with us. I think when we started, it was more of a handful, but now there's a significant number, especially, I guess, of the more kind of premium focused producers in Marlborough, and are seeing that's, great to see that increase. I think it's, and that we're seeing that same flow through with the percentages of organic wine coming from here. They do sort of, there is some commonality with the percentages of wine that come from Marlborough anyway. So, but being the biggest region, that has its challenges because, some people have a different focus, but it's really great to see some of the larger companies here like Villa and Pernod and Gießen and all jumping on board with that and having significant, area into organics. Helps show people, I think, that it's not something that just the small producers can do. But yeah, I think we did it for a lot of different reasons, partly about, about soil health, partly about looking after our people. And then, I guess we're super mindful that we have a property that has a lot of history and just want to look after it the best way we can. And whoever we hand it on next to, I know I'm kind of handing it over in a better way than what I found it, basically. So, yeah.
Yeah. And I know in Marlborough as well, you're part of the Mana wine growing group down there, which is a group of producers, obviously, who are like-minded. And there does seem to be, that's one of the things that always strikes me, not just obviously in Marlborough, but in other regions, is that there is a lot of kind of collaboration and chat amongst people to support one another. And that's obviously been backed by, there's been a lot of work on the ground with organic wine growers and also New Zealand wine growers to put together things like the wine growing conferences, the organic vineyard focus project. Can you kind of give us an idea of how that kind of, I guess, is helping to build that groundswell with people?
Yeah, I think it's hugely important to have those tools, because I think some of those things are what people can sometimes be the roadblocks a little bit. I think people get worried about, how they're going to do their undervine. So having that, there's an undervine mentoring program that's in place now. So people who are wanting to convert can kind of pair up with an experienced practitioner who can help them, get past some pitfalls or help with a bit of advice about what's the best equipment for their site and all that. And they're little, they're helping break down some of those barriers to why people might be, afraid or worry about it or, have questions. There's been a great piece of work put out as well on cover crops, and things like that too, because a lot of those things don't have to be, limited to organic properties. They can be, incorporated everywhere. But yeah, the Focus Vineyard project, I think, was particularly important. That's a piece of work that was done a while ago now, but that was a really great breakdown, and I think helped debunk a lot of the myths that, it's going to cost more. It's going to be, when you could see vineyards run side by side that were in kind of 3 different regions of New Zealand. That was a very, important piece of work to see that cost side by side, looking at the wines, and for me, the best thing I think I took from it was saying that a couple of the people involved in that project saw better quality coming off, their organic vineyards, which I think has been the drive, across New Zealand for a lot of the premium producers has been, that's what it's all about. It's about making wines connected to the place, but it's also about that drive for, looking for what's that X factor for, for your particular property and what you're trying to do. And, personal disclaimer opinion, for me, organics is the way to get there. So, it's great to see those resources, because when we first started, there wasn't as much, but that collaboration is important to have other people to talk to when you do come across a problem or an issue. Having that network makes the difference sometimes between, staying the course and not.
Yeah, I'm often struck by, I've been lucky enough to attend a couple of the organic and biodynamic wine growing conferences, and the practical information that's on offer there for producers is phenomenal, right down to producers being really transparent with, cost per acre of things, so that you get that strong sense that everybody out there is really helping. I know obviously in your region, I've got quite a tasty Dog Point Chardonnay here lined up in front of me as well. They've been, I guess, quite high profile organic producer, and also with being growers for a lot of other ones, who've allowed some other companies, I guess, to dip their toe in the water by being able to buy an organic fruit as well. That seems to be something that's, increasingly available for people on the market to get some wines. Yeah. And
Yeah,
I think,
really important.
yeah. And so you mentioned about that, being able to get with the technology and things. Hugh, I know when we were speaking previously, you mentioned about that ability to be able to look over and see what your neighbours are doing and see that technology, and that's also, that makes it seem, I guess, a little bit less daunting for people to take that plunge. Has that been your experience?
Yes. Yeah, I think it's come a long way. New Zealand wine with organics, and it's the critical mass. There's a number of doing now, and then worldwide as well. So the equipment getting better and more efficient, and the big challenge really to farm organically or vineyards is that under vine management, and now we have access to some really good equipment, and that makes it practical, and you can actually achieve it in a larger scale. And so that that momentum's happening now quite fast, I think. And then as people do it, more learn how to use it better on their particular sites. Because I guess for us as a company, we've got Pyramid Valley, obviously that Mike and Claudia founded in 2000 as biodynamic from inception on this clay limestone site, quite vigorous site with weeds to grow back, but competition's not necessarily a bad thing. But then we've got a property in Central Otago that Nick Paul and our viticulturist manages, and that's really a dry climate. So when he manages weeds, they generally die and they don't grow back. And then we just in the process of converting a little place in the Gimlet Gravels in Hawke's Bay, which is a total different aspect. So it's really, taking, like Anna was saying, it's about your place and trying to farm to that place. And I think that's that whole concept of people, and food and wine in general, and is everyone's like looking at like how can they make do their best with their place. And I think organic farming is just about that mindset and thinking about how to do that. Versus conventionals, just like this is the list of how to do it, and then you just can do it at any property, which doesn't really work because that's not how soil works. But that was probably the mindset 20 years ago. So I think the mindset's changing with the equipment, makes it possible, I guess, and the knowledge.
Yeah, I think that's a really interesting area for wine too, because now there's obviously a very strong groundswell towards people having organic food and questioning where the products that they eat and drink are coming from, which in my mind can only be a very positive movement. And so it's fantastic, I think, to see people making those links to wine, which has obviously been a product that's always indelibly connected to its land, but to start to ask about is that land actually being looked after, and how is that, as Anna says, being passed on to the next generation. I was actually struck, Anna, when you mentioned that about your experience with I guess the land becoming, or the vines becoming more resilient as well. That was something that was someone said to me once, was a viticulturist for Villa Maria, and it was after probably, shall we say, a slightly more challenging vintage in the region. And they had recently converted a couple of blocks, and they were really worried about those blocks going into that kind of season. And yet actually, as it went through, it proved that the organic blocks were far more resilient to the disease pressures and things that they had experienced. And he mentioned that because these blocks are side by side with some conventional blocks, that had been something that was a real eye opener for the neighbours there, who had suddenly kind of thought, maybe these guys are onto something here. I know, like Hugh, obviously you're based in North Canterbury, and which is a pretty small region, even by New Zealand's relatively small wine industry. But you've worked in a number of regions and continuing to work with across the region. So I've got actually a Marlborough Sauvignon of yours here, even though you're based in North Canterbury. But have you found there's sort of a different, I guess, working across the regions? We've got somewhere like Central Otago, which is roughly 25% organics, to other regions where it's a smaller percentage, a different kind of a mindset or conversations happening?
I think I guess some regions are catching up to Central Otago. They started like percentage-wise. I guess it depends, how big your region is, and that's your percentage can be thrown out that way a bit. But there's more and more people in North Canterbury that certified organic or in conversion or practicing organic, and they're just about to get into conversion. So it's that groundswell thing. So I think it's a similar thing. But like Central, I guess they've been doing it for longer, they're 25% now, I think, and it is a climate with that dry climate with weed control that they can, once they've cultivate or mow or whatever they do in the middle of summer, that it doesn't grow back because it's such an arid climate, which helps, and that has been the challenge. But I like most of the brands in North Canterbury, or the premium brands in North Canterbury, are in conversion or certified.
There's over 10% of the area in Canterbury is now certified organic.
Yeah. So it's pretty. And with Martin, before I left Martin, with Escarpment, we were in conversion, and now they're fully certified. And I think it's that whole movement of really wanting to try and make the best wine possible, and the only way you can do that is by farming the best way possible, and that's. Really.
Yeah. Well, I think, if you think about the process of organic wine or organic viticulture, it is something that by its very nature brings you in great contact with your land, isn't it? There's a lot of more kind of, I guess, time spent in the vineyard, and that type of thing has always got to be a beneficial process for anybody who's wanting to make good wine, is understanding your vineyards, being there in the dirt.
And Trudy, I guess having soil's living organism or living thing with lots of different living organisms all linked together, and that's acknowledging that instead of just it's a sterile thing and you just add different nutrients and then it's magically go into the plants, which isn't really how it happens. But that's the mindset. I think that's that learning your place. And for me, I guess it's 3 years here at Pyramid Valley, and I feel like I'm just starting to learn a little bit, but it's just a slow progression of trying to learn the place. And then we're farming about 8 hectares in Waipara. We've been farming about 12 hectares in Waipara as well, which is different. Again, it's only 20 minutes away, but it's challenges.
Yeah,
so it's
very different soil and environment. I think this is something we're quite lucky with organic and biodynamic wine in New Zealand, is that we have had some fairly pioneering people who have been doing this for a very long time. I mean, we talk about Central Otago with the likes of Ripon and Felton Road, who have been established. I've got this pretty nice Felton Calvert here, which I can actually see the vineyard nearly where I am at the moment. But they've been doing this for a long time, and same with James Milton up in Gisborne. So you talk about maybe it's almost one extreme to the other, really, isn't it, from Central Otago to Gisborne in terms of growing conditions.
James Milton got registered in 1989, so he's been going the longest of anyone in New Zealand at least. He was one of the first biodynamic.
Talks about how crazy people thought he was back then, and how now people are increasingly keen to have a little bit of that crazy in their life. But I think, when you have people who are also such enthusiastic and generous mentors for people, as, the likes of, the people I've just mentioned have been, that's helped a lot for people, I think, in New Zealand to feel that they can give things a go. I mean, I guess, Jared, you will have seen a lot of that over the years, that in 20 odd years of BioGrow, that kind of change happening, I guess, from those people who were initially regarded as relatively, fringe type of within the New Zealand wine industry, to this becoming something that, as I said, a lot of people are increasingly interested in what's happening and seeing the results. As Anna said, there's some of our probably high profile producers are organic and biodynamic.
Yeah, I would say a high percentage of the iconic brands in New Zealand are now organic. And I think it's pretty fast becoming a time when, if you are a high-priced and high-profile or iconic brand in New Zealand and you're not organic, your buyers are starting to ask why. Why aren't you organic? Look at all these people that are organic. Why aren't you? So that, I think it's making a lot of people sit up and take notice. But going back to a point you made earlier about consumers being interested in the food they eat and where it comes from and the health aspects of it and the environmental benefits of it, I think viticulture was a little bit late to the party in that regard. So organic food production has been going on for a long time. Organic wine really started taking off. The early sort of pioneers notwithstanding, organic viticulture really started taking off really in the mid 2000, about 2005 onwards, but really has come in leaps and bounds, and it's now really one of the star performers of organics in New Zealand. So there's 235 organic vineyards in New Zealand. There's a very well supported industry. There's a good organic wine growers body. New Zealand Wine Growers has got strong support, or strongly supports the organic producers. So I think it's done really well.
Yeah, long may that continue. I know, however, when we look at organic food, it's always fascinated me that I can go into my supermarket, and I live in a relatively small town, and it's really easy for me to distinguish, what are the organic foods there, because they are very clearly, it's marketed over. But with wine, that isn't necessarily always the case. Often you do need to turn a bottle around. It's not necessarily, I guess, as out front there. And I'm heartened that is beginning to change, that there are people who are now displaying the labels. But I'm guessing as well that, some of this comes down to, obviously, New Zealand is is a small industry, and it's made up of a lot of very small producers for the main part. I think wondering about when we're talking about some of the export challenges, because New Zealand is obviously a highly export-driven market, in terms of the labelling, whether this is also a kind of a having to straddle, like for instance, when you're the size of, say, Anna, you can't just easily produce a whole lot of different labels and things like that for your markets. Can you kind of walk us through a little bit of the challenges of that? We talked a little bit earlier about the different requirements for going in there, but in terms of, is everybody able to loud and proud organic across their wine, or do you then have to kind of navigate that for your different markets?
You certainly have to navigate it for different markets. There are different rules in the different countries. So if we're talking about the UK, for example, EU and UK, there's a particular code that is required to be on the label that designates the certifier is approved to certify to the European and UK markets. And also in EU and UK, the importer needs to be certified to receive organic wine, even though it's a tamper-proof bottled product. They need to be certified to receive that, and there are some importers that are not. So for small producers like Anna at Whareroa, for example, some of their importers may be certified and some may not, and that will mean having organic claims on some labels and taking those claims off other labels, even though they're going into the same market. So it's complex for small producers. And then the North American markets, the US and Canada, have got their own label rules for organic products, not just for wine labels, but then once you add the organic rules on top of that, it's quite a complex area for producers to navigate. So New Zealand is currently going through a regulation development process. New Zealand and Australia are two of the only sort of developed countries that don't have a regulation controlling organic claims. So BioGrow is a private standard, but we certify to those overseas markets that have regulations. Once New Zealand has a regulation in place for organic products, that will enable New Zealand to negotiate more effectively with those countries for market access.
So one of the things that will, I presume, help as well is if the people who want our wines in those various markets become advocates for their, importers to start
Absolutely.
Getting certified and to do that. So everybody who is hopefully listening to this will be enthusiastic about organic wine. So there's a little task for you to keep pushing, because I know, I've got a glass of Greenhoff Hope Chardonnay here, who are a tiny producer in Nelson, and I can't imagine, just those logistical hurdles, not only only to get these wines into the bottle to begin with all the challenges that vignerons have to begin with, but then to navigate this from an export perspective. So the more that the people at the other end of the process, which is you guys watching this, can help with that, the better. I saw Anna, the very wry nods. It looks, it's obviously, some deep experience there for being a small producer getting to market.
Yeah, it's hugely challenging, I think, because you don't, I think, realise, you go in there with the right intentions, but sometimes the compliance part of it can kind of suck the fun out of it, shall we say, is a good way of saying it. Because I think it is, like Jared alluded to, it's, you're wearing a lot of hats already. And I mean, for example, we produce 15 different wines, I think, at last count. And 14 of those are, fully certified organic with BioGrow. And we are not labelling as organic for the US and Canada for the reasons that Jared alluded to earlier, because we do use minimal amounts of sulfites, but also the compound that we use to make those additions is the one that doesn't fit for the US market. So yeah, for example, so those wines are, available domestically and in the kind of, and in the EU with those organic on the label, but then in other markets we're selling, it's not labelled as certified organic. So yeah, for 15 different wines and potentially 15 different markets for those wines, it's a huge, and it's a lot of cost. That's the other thing. So it's adding cost all the time. And if we have to, we might have already labelled and then you have to relabel, or you're having to change the label. It's it'll be great to have that domestic standard in place. It's hugely important, and I think it was sort of overlooked, I think, originally, not by BioGrow, but, it's great to see that work happening, because once we have that, then we have a bargaining place to come from of, especially with trade agreements and things like that, to go, well, look, we have a domestic standard now. This is what it is. And then we have a seat at the table for being able to hopefully smooth the pathways, because again, if you're a small winery, you've often got smaller importers and, and you're sending mixed shipments and that kind of thing. Like some of our small European importers, for example, might be buying a pallet of mixed wines from us a year. There might be 10 different wines on that pallet, and 5 cases of each. It adds up, and that's a reason why, again, sometimes too, with them having to be certified and have that cost, they look at it too and think, oh, well, so yeah, it's unfortunate, because I think it is, it's a great thing, and you kind of wear it as a badge of pride, and then you realise when you get further into it about some of those challenges. But I think it's, again, it's great to have that network, because you talk to other people and other producers and say, okay, what have you done with your labels? How can we make this work practically, that we're sort of setting ourselves up to be a bit more flexible or have those multi-market considerations. And and there's a great resource now of other people to ask. But yeah, it can sometimes be a bit challenging. Yeah, so hence the rye look from my way. But hey, it's just another challenge in the day.
Another thing to add to the list. Hugh, Pyramid Valley is obviously a tiny producer. Do you have that same sort of straddle, I guess, with navigating? I mean, you obviously there's quite a lot of sales on the domestic market for your wines as well, but is this something for your export markets that?
Yeah, well, that's a similar thing that we don't label as BioGrow US market, which is one of our major markets, because of those sulfite issues. So use the same as Anna, minimal to ensure that we're capturing our vineyard model. So that's same kind of issue. So it'd be great to label them more clearly. I think one thing, as a consumer, like websites are great to be able to see how people are farming, which I think is the main thing, and that's and then researching those producers. And I think high-end wine or more premium wine, the consumer is probably looking to research what they're drinking more too. So there's ways to communicate how we're making the wine and farming more than just on the label as well. So I think that's for consumers is just to get on the website or Instagram page, and they'll see how people are doing it.
Yeah, you beat me to it there. I think that's one of the brilliant kind of things that we've all had to particularly discover in the last sort of year or so, isn't it? When we've got a lot of, you can't get out into your markets necessarily, and we can't bring people here to show what we're doing. But there is obviously a wealth of information online with producers, with their websites, with their social media, with, the organic wine growers. Site as well has a lot of information about what's going on with New Zealand producers there, which and just some, I think, incredibly beautiful vineyards too, which are worth exploring, because I know I always love that connection between what's in my glass and then thinking about where it's from. And if you're lucky enough sometimes to have gone and stood in those vineyards, it's neat. But the next best thing is if you can go and visit those sites and get a feel for the people who are making it and where it is and what everything looks like. I guess too, that's kind of one of those things that comes back to, what is it that draws people to organics, not only as a producer, but as a consumer, isn't it? Is that kind of increased connection? Hugh, what is it that organics kind of means to you? Why is it that you think this is something that's important for not only you personally, but within the context of New Zealand wine, I suppose?
I think it's just, there's only one, earth that we've got in one place, and that's, it's about, as Anna said earlier, the mindset of leaving something in a better place than you found it, and treating, like the soil and what's beneath us is a lot more happening there than above us, and having a understanding of how vast the world is and how insignificant we are, and just how we can fit into it. And to me, that's just that want to really farm. Winemaking for me is just farming that bit of land and trying to make our best expression of that side. And then organics is the way the way to farm that, and it's just that way we organically farm. Like our property would be different to Anna, or it's about being your property and doing what's right for your property by trial and error, I guess. But that Nick Paulin, who's our viticulturist, has done a good little experiment in Central Otago at a property there with cover crops and undies, and so he buried cotton undies in an area of the vineyard.
Is that like shorthand for undervine or something? But no, you're actually mentioning undies, underwear, knickers, pants, or all the markets.
It shows you. So he buried it under a grass area, just ryegrass, and then under a diverse cover crop, and then dug them back up, and basically where it was buried under the diverse cover crop, all there was less was the elastic, and under the grass it was like partially degraded. And it really shows you how much activity is happening in the soil in that when you have some diversity there. So I think that's that's it. I don't know, I've got off track, but it's just how much is happening below.
I think if there's one thing everyone's going to remember from this, hopefully they'll remember a lot of other things, but everyone's going to remember that one. Good on Nick. Nick and the knickers. Sorry. We'll keep this on track. Anna, I mean, you've obviously alluded to this as well, but you're 17 years down the track now. I imagine that you're kind of looking at things probably in some ways the same, but in some ways a very different kind of a person now from when you started out there.
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's exactly what Hugh said. It's just looking after your little bit of land, and that's different for different people. It's not a recipe. There's different things that work on different sites, and it takes a while to work that out. But I think, like he said, the goal is to have, resilient vines, to have that beautiful biological activity. James, the fairy godfather of organics in New Zealand is what Jason and I refer to him as. He has that very poetic thing of, be careful because you're walking on the roof of another kingdom. And I think that's the hard thing about soil. To a lot of people, it just looks like dirt. You can't see what's in there. But, with that whole knowing, the amount of activity that it can be, and literally a teaspoon of it, if people could see that under a microscope, I think they would care more about it. I think, I often explain it to customers in Cellar Door that, when you've been snorkeling somewhere on the Great Barrier Reef, for example, you can see all of that amazing life in like a cubic metre of water in front of you. people get hugely passionate about protecting it and looking after it. And it's the hard thing with soil because you can't see it. You know, if only you could give them a microscope and they could see it, I think they would care more, because it's hugely important and it makes such a big difference. You know, the whole encouraging the biology in the soil, you know, thinking about biodiversity, because obviously vineyards, you know, do run the risk of becoming a big monoculture. You know, you have vines, you have grass that's mown, looks all super tidy. And as we know, New Zealand is a pretty into neatness. I think if it was, you know, an Olympic sport, would be on the podium for that. But it's, you can do so much more with just thinking about how you manage your mid-rows. And that's, yeah, just great to see. We even this year have planted had to replant our paddock where we make our hay, because we use that in our compost and for our cows. And Jason planted a mix in there that's, I think, about 17 or 18 different species. And it's just so great to see that and the difference that it's making. And, you know, we've started doing some soil tests in there so we can monitor the, you know, the differences that we're making, because often we're doing, you know, soil tests in the vineyard, but that part of the land has been, you know, our cows are on it and we make hay from it, but we hadn't included it in the, you know, soil test program before. So we're doing that now so we can monitor. And I think it's just always getting better, never feeling like you've achieved everything. There's always something that you want to do to keep, like Hugh was saying about the learnings, you know, there's different seasons throw you different curveballs, and something comes up before that you haven't tried, or you talk to someone else. So it's just, you're never going to rest on your laurels and go, okay, we've done it all now. You're kind of always, you know, trialing new things and keeping going there with that. So I think that's important. But yeah, I just love the learning part of it. I think it's probably why we're all in wine in the first place. You know, it's that sort of search for never knowing everything. There's always something new to learn or new to try. And I think it's just great to see the groundswell of momentum that we have with organics now in New Zealand, that, you know, if people listed their probably top 10 favourite wines, you know, especially in the premium end, I'd probably guarantee that maybe 70% of them probably are organic or BD or somewhere along the conversion process. So, yeah, it's just exciting. I think we're in such an exciting phase of it now.
Yeah, and I think too, you know, you mentioned there too, you know, nothing stays the same, and the environment in which we're living these days is definitely not the same. I mean, climate change is here, whether people like it or not, and, you know, wine is going to have to deal with that. But it seems to me we were talking, I mean, I got a glass of the Stonecroft Syrah here, who are based in Hawke's Bay. And Hawke's Bay's had a couple of, I mean, amazing harvests lately, but there's also been some very, very dry years. And having the ability in organic vineyards for, you know, you're obviously constantly improving that organic matter that's in the soil from a water holding capacity. I was fascinated when you mentioned about the water holding capacity of your vineyard there, because it struck me as, you know, this is a very strong tool that we have for help vineyards, you know, navigate their way through the changing climate and perhaps less accessibility to water. So you said, what was your ability to hold water?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think it's the figures that I've seen are basically a 1% difference in organic matter is the ability of that land to hold basically 130,000 to 170,000 litres more per hectare. So, I mean, that's hugely important. If you look at where our wine growing regions are in general, you know, probably with the exception of Gisborne, we're on the East Coast, we're in all the dry parts of New Zealand. We're seeing, you know, drier and drier seasons. You know, we're seeing more weather variability. So basically with sort of, since we took over the property here, especially with the older part of the vineyard, we started at about 2% organic matter, and we've now got parts of the property to nearly 7%. So we did a calculation that worked out with that 5% increase across the property in the sort of, you know, since we started our, you know, certification and whatever. I mean, Jason started doing cover crops straight away to make that difference. We've now got the ability on just our little 11 hectares to hold 6.5 million litres of water, you know, in the soil. Like, if we think about that, it's just so, I don't know, it's just so exciting. And again, it's one of those things that's not measurable. It's not, well, it is measurable, but, you know, it's not obvious. People don't see it from just walking on your property, and, you know, they see the obvious things, the vines, the buildings, the whatever, but what we can do there, and especially that's translatable across so many different properties. It doesn't necessarily have to be, if people didn't want to go the whole hog of getting certified organic, they can still plant a cover crop, you know, like it's, a lot of those things are applicable, I think, to the greater part of the industry. And yeah, it does make us future proof. It's really helping with some of those challenges that we might be facing in the next 10 years and the next 20 years. You know, we're seeing our vintages start earlier and earlier in the season, and those more variabilities. And for me, it's just a great tool to have there to know that we've banked that, basically, that, you know, in a year like this when we've had a really wet winter, you know, we're storing that, we're soaking it all up in even more than we could before. So yeah, hugely important.
Yeah, I often think, you know, when I've gone to various organic wine growing conferences, I come away feeling, you know, because it's kind of easy sometimes to read the news and feel a bit depressed in many respects. But, you know, when you look
right now.
But when I come away and I look at some of the phenomenal things that are happening and also a lot of the really fascinating research in this area, it makes me feel really heartened and, you know, to feel as though not only are, you know, organic producers doing something, you know, for the, I guess, future-proofing, as you say, of their land. You know, they're amazing vineyards to walk in because they always do feel so alive, but also that we are, you know, being a positive contributor to the industry and to the world in that regard, which is, you know, it's a really, I guess, yeah, satisfying feeling to have that. And I guess, you know, when you have a look, Jared, over the kind of 20 odd years that you will have been involved with this, you know, this research, there's some really amazing cutting edge stuff that's going on in organic vineyards with a lot of, you know, kind of comparative studies and things increasingly. And, you know, when you look at things like the soil health, that is such an incredible thing. When you think the World Health Organization, I think it was, estimated that this is for agriculture as a whole, that there's possibly only, you know, 80 harvests left in the world or 80 years of viable soil. I mean, I know that, you know, stats can be worked in lots of different ways, but the point is that's quite a scary sort of a situation. So being, you know, part of the solution rather than the problem is a very good place to be.
Yeah, and I think Anna made those points well about the water holding capacity and also carbon sequestration on soils that are biologically diverse and have good organic matter. And the other thing that is also good to keep in mind is the cultural aspect. You know, you mentioned that walking in organic vineyards is a really nice experience. Well, that's also nice for the workers in organic vineyards. You know, so it's important to consider that when you are when you own a business, when you're employing people, when you're looking after the earth, you're also looking after the people that you employ. You know, there's a lot of benefits that come from converting to organic production in food as well as wine.
Very much so. I'm just thinking, Hugh, having sat on the side of the hill in Pyramid Valley and looked out across that amazing kind of amphitheatre that you have there in the vineyard, with a whole lot of longhorn cattle just cruising on past. It's a pretty amazing environment to be in. I'll bet that's a place, you know, you were up at 1 o'clock this morning frost fighting. Must be at least nice to be able to do that in a beautiful environment.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, like it takes your breath away looking at the place and, you know, the environment. And, you know, that's New Zealand for me is it's got so much energy and vibrancy, and it's about, we need to ensure stays the way. I remember stepping off the plane for the first time in 2007 and just being blown away by just how amazingly beautiful New Zealand is, and the environment, and it's about protecting that and ensuring that's, you know, going forward for the future. That's, you know, that's kind of what everyone should be about, right?
Yeah, and as we're sort of discussing here, increasingly is. I mean, I think that's a really heartening thing, is to see, as we said, this year-on-year increase that's occurring of, you know, organic and biodynamic viticulture and wines in New Zealand is a really, really heartening process. Not only is it resulting in, you know, as we've, you know, been able to see some really, really delicious wines, but also a very, very good thing for our environment overall. So I think we can wrap that up today. I hope all of you watching have enjoyed and got a lot of information out of this, as we've had some really knowledgeable people talking here. As I said, please take advantage of that live chat. Make sure you've got, if there's any last questions there that you do want to ask, get those out there, because both Nigel and Clive will do a brilliant job of filling in any gaps and adding a few more great stories of their own. I don't doubt that for a second. I want to say a huge thank you to Anna, to Hugh, to Jared for joining me today. It's been brilliant to listen. I've learned a lot from this session, and again, feeling greatly encouraged about this amazing aspect of New Zealand wine. And so I hope everybody out there listening, you know, does their best to seek out these wines, to find out more information, to make connections, as you've seen New Zealand winemakers and BioGrow auditors are very enthusiastic and knowledgeable people and are more than happy to talk. So if you've got further questions, please don't hesitate to get in contact. You can direct them through New Zealand Wine Growers as well, and have a chat and keep exploring amazing New Zealand wine, organic wine. Thank you so much.
Hey, hopefully I'm there. Hopefully I'm live. Hello. I've been enjoying all the type questions backwards and forwards. And before we kind of get into more questions, I think there was one area that I'd really like to just come back to that we didn't have time to kind of type through. But when it comes to the economics of organic farming, it's not really about the cost of one kind of farming versus the other, because when you start doing organic or biodynamic farming, you change the way you farm, you change the things you want to do. And so regardless of the rules, you're not doing the same stuff. With us, it started with, hey, we'll have some chickens, and hey, look, those hills, we need goats on them. And we now need cows to keep the goats company. And wow, we're going to have to grow some animal food. And what about making some single vineyard compost? And so what you're doing isn't the same. And that's one reason why it's very hard to compare the cost. But it's surprising it doesn't go up as much as you might think. But there we go. Other things that we've been talking about at the moment. I tasted through the wines. I know everybody didn't have a chance to do that, but the samples of wines, I thought, all showed a kind of, almost you might say, the wines were very comfortable with themselves. They weren't trying to prove anything. They were just being what they should be. And I think that's not a bad thing. What's going, oh God, saying it's good to see my face. I'm glad it's good to see my face. There were quite a lot of conversations going on about the issues with labelling and standards. We're now 20 odd years into organics, and still most of our wine is not labelled organic. That's not because it isn't organic, it's because just the sheer grief of trying to deal with all the details of 45 markets, each with their own organic rules and variations, means that in most cases in this world, people know that we're biodynamic and have been for 20 years. They know we're organic, so we don't have to put a label on it. We do in some markets and for some people, but not for most. What else would anyone like to talk to? I don't know. Questions? Let me just backtrack through what we've been talking about here and have a quick look. One little point within all of this is biodynamics versus organics. Some people often ask, okay, what are the relative stats? What percentage is biodynamic? What percentage is organic? And you can't really label it or measure it that way very easily, because a lot of wineries will be certified in both. And so it's quite hard to unpick one from the other. But in general, within the EU system, you have to be certified with an organic certifier if it's a New Zealand wine, which is a long story that we won't go into. But that means that even though we've been a Demeter certified for a long time, we had to adopt a BioGrow certification as well, simply because that became necessary for the EU. It gets very, very complicated, I can tell you. That's the worst bit. Someone's saying, how's Genesis the cat? Very good. I'm in the UK. I've been locked out of the winery now for 16 months, which is, whoa. That's not easy. But I'm really, really hoping that I'm going to be able to be allowed back in January. New Zealand has lockout as, other people have lockdowns and New Zealand has lockout. And trying to get a slot to get back through biosecurity is so difficult that in general, we're waiting for the rules to relax so I can get back to the winery. And so I have to do everything remotely. What was this saying? Okay, Ray was asking, why did we go biodynamics, not organics? From the start, we started with organics, but I was keener on biodynamics. And the reason for that was I'd worked a lot in my past life with the car industry, and I had been really horrified by the way that they equated quality with zero defects. They had this generally accepted idea that if you have no defects, you have a quality product. And I thought, that's nonsense. You can have perfect rubbish. It's about the qualities that you put in, not the defects necessarily that you take out. And I felt that whereas organics was principally a list of, it was more like zero defects. These are all the things you mustn't do. And biodynamics, for all its flaws and some of the slightly crackpot areas, was really a philosophy that was focused on here are the things you should do, as opposed to here are the things you shouldn't do. And I like that. So, I'm not sold on all aspects of biodynamics, and that's fine. It's a broad church, and all of us kind of get on or get off the bus at slightly different points, but we all share our same kind of passion for how you manage this ever-changing ecosystem of the land. And we've got a question here, any uptick on consumer demand for organics? The answer to that is I don't know, because for so long now, everybody's kind of known that we were, and we sell more than all the wine we make. So it's really hard for me to answer that one. You'd think so, certainly. You'd think there has to be a greater awareness. But, it's difficult to know. I think it varies from country to country. And there's glancing through one of these, what do you find are the biggest similarities and differences between Felton Road and other? I'll tell you the thing that I find interesting with that is that it's a thing all the way around the world, that essentially people who are farming organically and biodynamically, in most cases, spend a lot more time physically on their land. There's this saying of farmers' footsteps are the best compost. And I think getting out of a tractor and actually being on your feet and bending over and digging in the soil with your hands, and really thinking about what's going around, is something that all organic farmers, biodynamic farmers have in common. We're trying to unravel this amazing web. Somebody made reference to James Milton's lovely thing, be careful how you step on my land. You're not standing on the dirt, you're stepping on the roof of another kingdom. And we're trying to understand that kingdom. It's a kingdom where one spoonful of soil has more organisms than there are people on Earth. And that's quite cool. Anything else I can think of? Not immediately. I hope everyone's enjoyed it. It'd be lovely to see so many faces or names I could see flicking through there, and I kind of wanted to stop and chat, and we can't right now. But as times get a bit more normal, hopefully we can all sit down and share glasses and do all of those things again around the world. Someone's just said, what are the most popular cover crops planted in New Zealand for organic vineyards to bring life back into the soil? We go wider and wider, and often it's based on things that we like. I was getting the guys to plant peas because I wanted peas to pick for lunch. And then we found pigeons came to eat the peas because pigeons like peas. And then we found falcons came to eat pigeons because falcons like pigeons. And suddenly you opened up this whole new little ecosystem that you didn't know was going on just because you planted some peas. So, cover crops are interesting, but it's often most interesting just to do some nice, do things because you like to eat them and then see what else in the world likes to eat them that comes and plays in your vineyard. So, I'll probably wrap up now. Thanks to everybody for listening. I hope to see all of you soon. And, hang on, my glass is empty. But